Hey everyone, hope you're having a beautiful and inspiring day, and thanks so much for joining me today for another watercolor painting tutorial. I've prepared another beginner-friendly step-by-step tutorial to share with you today, in which we'll only be using 5 different colors and we'll have the opportunity to practice both wet on wet and wet on dry techniques in one same piece. Along the way, I'm also going to be sharing some of the things that I make sure to have in mind, some tips and tricks that'll help you develop a believable sense of 3D form even in looser paintings. I'm also going to be sharing a way in which I'm currently making interesting use of color in cast shadow areas so that I can not only bring in more points of interest into my piece, but also better integrate my cast shadow with my subject, which at the end leads to a more harmonious result. Alright, so without much further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get started with sharing my freehand preliminary sketching process with you guys. I wanted to make sure to include this part of the process just for you guys who are interested in creating these freehand sketches for yourself prior to getting started with your painting process. This way I can also offer you some tips and some things that I always make sure to have in mind so that I can successfully create my preliminary sketch and have a solid base to jump off from for my painting. This said, if you're not interested in practicing your freehand sketching skills and you want to jump straight on over onto the painting part of this video, I'm going to make sure to leave a timestamp to that part of the tutorial down below for you in the description box, so you can go ahead and skip right on to that. And not only this, but I'm also going to be making my outline sketch available for you guys completely for free, along with my reference photo that I'm sharing right now on screen, a photo of my finished piece, which you can also use as reference as you're working, and my downloadable supply list, including the colors that I used for this piece. All of that is going to be available for you for free via the link that I'm also going to be leaving down below for you in the description box right below the timestamp. You can click on that. It's going to take you to a special post on my Patreon page, which is open for everyone to enjoy. And you're going to be able to find those files at the end as attachments on that post. So you can just grab that outline sketch, transfer it onto your watercolor paper using tracing paper or your transferring method of choice, and go ahead and skip on over to that part of this process. All right, so right here, what I am doing is I am creating my outline sketch very, very lightly using my HB drawing pencil. And I always like creating my pencil sketches very lightly because I don't want to be able to see my pencil through my translucent paint at the end. And also I want to be able to erase my mistakes as I go because I am drawing this completely freehand, so I'm bound to, have to fix some mistakes along the way. And also I don't want to scratch or damage my paper in any way, shape, or form. And this is why it's so important to draw lightly. Sometimes when I am going to be drawing something that maybe I'm not so comfortable drawing, that I feel I'm going to have to do a lot of erasing on, I would rather create that outline sketch somewhere else, maybe a sketchbook or something like that, and then I use tracing paper to transfer that outline sketch onto my watercolor sheet. But if it's something relatively simple, maybe something that I have drawn before or something that I feel I won't have to do too much erasing on, I just go ahead and sketch straight on my watercolor paper. And just like what I share in past freehand sketching videos, which I highly recommend checking them out, I'm going to make sure to leave a link to 1 or 2 down below in the description box because I go much more into depth into my freehand sketching method and the main things that I've learned and that I make sure to have in mind along the way. I make sure to see this as a whole. I don't really focus on a specific little part or move on to smaller parts until the whole has been made sense of. And I always make sure to start with the largest shapes and forms first and make my way towards smaller shapes and details only after the largest shapes and forms have been properly achieved, have been properly placed within space, and I've arrived at relatively good proportions. I'm constantly comparing different elements to each other in terms of width, in terms of height, in terms of the angles they create upon each other, etc., on and on and on. but it's very important that I focus on the large things first, because otherwise it's going to be a lot more difficult for me to achieve effective proportions and also to utilize my drawing space effectively. With this particular piece, I'm really visualizing these watermelon slices as triangular prisms. So it's so helpful to visualize what you're looking at as simple geometric forms or combinations of simple geometric forms. Why? Because this helps me make sense of the planes that are making up these 3D forms. If I don't understand these forms as having volume, as being 3D, as having mass, then it's going to be more difficult for me to develop values throughout them and develop at least somewhat of a believable sensation of 3D form. And so by me imagining these as triangular prisms, I can tell they're different planes making up those structures, and I'm going to be able to develop color and value throughout these structures a lot more effectively. With the term plane, I am simply referring to the different sides making up this three-dimensional structure. Of course, these triangular prisms have somewhat of a curved section to them, a curved plane, but I am still visualizing these just in a simplified way. And for this particular one, it was very important for me to notice all of those different angles that these triangular prisms create. And I'm just trying to replicate those angles to the best of my abilities. Okay, so right here, as you can see, I'm starting to add in the smaller little details, the seeds, and also a little separation where that outer green skin ends and where the fleshy inside part begins, where the color changes. I've also added in a shape for my cast shadow so that I can know where that is going to be located. This is very important. I never get started with the painting process until I have pinpointed my light source in relation to my different elements. Where is my light source located in relation to what I am going to be painting in that reference photo, or if I am just getting very loosely inspired from that reference photo and I'm going to be bringing in a lot of my imagination into the piece, I make sure to decide on where the light source is going to be located. And with that light source in mind, I draw in the cast shadow opposite to the light source. This is very important because in order for your piece to have mid to higher levels of realism, those values throughout the element or the different elements that are part of the whole, they have to make sense in relation to where the light source or light sources are located, and also those cast shadows have to be consistent throughout. After finishing up, I lightly tapped my kneaded eraser over my sketch to eliminate any extra graphite to lighten my sketch a little bit more, and then it was time to get started with the painting process. Okay, so the colors that I am going to be using for this piece, they're really only 5, and you by no means have to use these exact same colors, especially for this one. Just use anything that is similar and you're going to be perfectly fine. I'm going to be using one color from my Van Gogh half pan set, and this is the Azo Green Yellow, and 4 colors from my White Night set from St. Petersburg, and these colors are Ruby, Green, Ultramarine Blue, and Burnt Umber. Now I'm going to take a moment to very quickly answer a question that I often get asked about, and this is whether you can mix paint from different watercolor brands in one same piece. And the answer is yes, at least I do it quite frequently. The only thing that I'd make sure to do is that the paints that you're mixing together are similar in quality. I would never mix together lower quality paint with higher quality paint. It's important to just take into account that lower quality paint has a lower quality binder usually and a less amount of pigment in it. And so things are bound to just not mix together quite well. And even if you do use some higher quality colors, overall at the end, the outcome is not going to look that great because you're using some colors that have less of a color payoff and a less vibrancy to them. All right, so let's go ahead and get started with today's painting process. So here are my 5 paint pans, and essentially I have prepared two different greens for myself, a lighter green and a darker green, which are going to be used to create the different greens and green values in the outer skin of the watermelon. I have only one red, which I'm going to be using in a variety of different translucencies and values to paint in the red sections of the watermelon slices. The seeds are going to be painted in with two different layers. I'm going to be painting them with a mixture of my ruby plus my green. That is going to create a very dark color, almost like a warm black. And I'm going to be dropping that in wet on wet to create a diffused look for some of those seeds. And then after that, once everything is dry, I'm actually going to be painting in some seeds on dry paper so that I can paint in some seeds that have some sharper edges around them. And finally, to paint in the cast shadows, I'm going to be using a mixture of burnt umber plus ultramarine blue. That is going to create a very dark gray that looks even black at its most saturated. I'm also going to be using my two greens in that cast shadow. Okay, so I'm going to be using my size 14 round brush for this first part of the painting process. I am preparing it right here by swiveling my paintbrush in my container of water to prepare those bristles. And I remove the excess water and swivel those bristles in my paint pan to start bringing out color onto the swell on my color mixing palette. And my objective is to create a nice, juicy, yet saturated color mixture right there that has some amount of water in it, but I really want a good amount of color in it as well. Because what I'm going to be doing next is I am going to be removing all of the color from my paintbrush bristles, removing the excess water, and I'm going to start pre-wetting the entire kind of overall shape created by these watermelon wedges. And I'm going to be dropping in my ruby into this pre-wetted large shape. And the thing that is important to just take note of here is that because I'm going to be doing my pre-wetting with clean water in this entire area, there is already going to be some amount of water content on my paper by the time I drop in my color. And so if my color mixture is super watery and very translucent on my color mixing palette, and I drop it into paper that has been pre-wetted, that already has some water on it, then that amount of water content on my paper is going to be added to the huge amount of water content in my color mixture, making that color look even weaker, even paler, even more translucent. And so when I am using this pre-wetting technique, I like making sure that I am going in with a good amount of color in my paintbrush right off the bat. And yes, of course, I'm looking at that reference photo to make sure that I'm dropping it into darker value areas first, so that that color expands out from those darker value areas that I see in that reference photo and create a graded look into lighter value areas. And I also make sure to drop in just a little bit of color at a time. And once I feel I've placed enough color, I remove the paint from my paintbrush bristles and I go back in to do gentle, very gentle moving around of that color so that I can sometimes help that color move out and create gradients into lighter value areas. So even though I'm going in with a good amount of color right off the bat, I am making sure to, number one, place it in the darker value areas. So select places that I'm actually going to be developing darker red values in. And two, I am making sure to place just a bit of color at a time because I definitely don't want to create a flat look in those red sections and have one flat red value or translucency all throughout the watermelon, because that is not going to lead to a very 3D or believable look. I definitely want certain sections at the end that look very light and translucent, and others in which that red is darker and more saturated. So right here you can see me continue doing my pre-wetting. I am really taking my time doing that pre-wetting, making sure that I arrive at a nice even sheen all throughout, that I don't have any puddles anywhere, and I go over everything at least 3 to 4 times so that I can make sure that no specific area starts drying on me way too fast. And just as a tip for those of you who, like me, live in a very warm, humid environment and you usually have a fan on or the air conditioning on, just please know that if you have a fan on and it's over you or it's close to you, this might have a great impact on how quickly your paper dries. So what I like doing when I am painting and using this technique is I like turning off the fan. Doesn't matter if it gets sweaty, but I'd rather have my paper not dry so fast, because that is exactly why I take my time to do my pre-wetting. Because I want a greater amount of working time before that paper starts to dry. I know that when I use wet on dry techniques and I go ahead and start painting on paper that is dry, that paper starts absorbing that paint immediately, and your paper starts drying pretty immediately too. And so you just have a certain amount of working time before that paint starts drying on you. And if you've been working with watercolor for any amount of time, then you're probably already well aware that you shouldn't be moving that paint around if it's in that semi-dry, awkward state. You really have to take advantage and kind of move fast while that paint is still wet, and then you have to let it dry and not go in and try to do moving around while that paper is in that awkward state, because that is going to lead to splotchiness and to an overall overworked look. And the more you practice with watercolor, the more easily you're going to be able to tell when that paper arrives at that awkward state in which it's already partially dry, and when you have to basically allow that section to dry completely before attempting to go in to darken or add more details, or if you can actually go ahead and start adding a little bit more paint or work it a little bit more before allowing it to dry. When you take time to do pre-wetting effectively, of course, the way that I did before getting started with dropping in my color today, you have more working time to drop in a little bit more color, and you can do a little bit more before things start to dry on you. Not only this, but that water that's on your paper is going to lead to soft transitions between your different values. So you're not going to be left with sharp defined edges around the shapes that you're painting in. So to explain a bit more about my process here with the wet on wet, after I did my pre-wetting, after I arrived at a nice even sheen all throughout this space, I loaded up my paintbrush bristles. This is still my size 14 round brush, and as I said, I dropped in my color in the darkest red value areas that I'm able to see in that reference photo. I jumped around with one same paintbrush load, dropping in that deep saturated red in darkest value areas all throughout these different elements. And then I basically remove the color from my paintbrush bristles. I remove the excess water by gently scraping my bristles along the top of my container. I never want to go in with a ton of water in my paintbrush bristles, especially if my paper already has some amount of water/paint on it, because that can lead to backruns and undesired effects. So whenever you go into your container of water, always make sure to remove the excess drippage. You're also going to see me constantly use my absorbent towel to stay on top of water control. I have it on hand so that I can go in to do quick lifting whenever I've accidentally dropped in way too much paint or water on my paper. I go in immediately and lift that up with my absorbent towel, but I also use it to remove excess beads of water on the ferrule on my brush, and also sometimes I gently touch just the tip of my paintbrush on it and remove that excess drippage before going into my painting with it. And then with just a small amount of water in my paintbrush bristles, I gently move that color that's already been placed on my paper. I pull it into lighter value areas to help those gradients happen, and I get rid of undesired textures while that paint is still wet. And of course, as you go in with your clean and slightly damp paintbrush and you continue distributing that same color amongst a bigger area, you soften that saturated color. I would highly recommend making sure to leave sections in these red portions of the watermelons with little to no paint in them so that you can have some highlights in them and have a nice kind of light effect and a moist look at the end. Remember that the intention here is to create dark reds, to create a wide range of midtones, and to also make sure that you're saving lighter areas. This is what's going to lead to a believable look. If you apply your color as if you were painting a wall of a house or painting with an opaque painting medium such as acrylics or oils, that is going to lead to a flat look and you're going to get rid of your highlights. And this is also not going to lead to that overall glowy light look that watercolor allows. At this point, this entire area is still wet. I can continue going in with more layers and continue to darken darkest value areas because things are still wet because I took time to do that pre-wetting in the beginning. At this point, I would say that I've already gone in with around 3 to 4 loads of paint, overlapping that paint color, especially in darkest value areas that I want to push darker values in. And I make my way slowly and incrementally towards darker values. Remember, it's always going to be easier to go in and darken than it is to go in and lighten. So take it a step at a time. Whenever I go into my paint palette to grab more paint or load up my paintbrush with more paint, I always get started by dropping in that color into darkest value areas and I pull out that color from there. And whenever it is that I want to darken a lighter mid-tone area, I make sure to only take a small amount of paint from my paint mixing palette, or I wait until that load of paint is running out from my paintbrush bristles, and then I go into lighter value areas. And even though this is a looser piece, even though I'm not going for super high levels of realism, I am still constantly looking at that reference photo for clues and ideas as to where darkest values need to be developed, where midtones are, and where lightest light areas are. Okay, so right around here, I take a moment to step back from my piece and acknowledge everything as a whole that I've done so far. And I'm already able to tell that I've developed a nice range of values. I have sections in which that whiteness of the paper is shining through almost completely or completely. I have very, very light pink areas in which that paint is super light and translucent. I have darker mid-tone areas and I have darkest dark red areas. So I'm pretty happy with how everything is looking. Just a moment ago, I did a little bit of lifting in a section that I feel I've darkened way too much, and I just use the clean and slightly damp paintbrush bristles as a little absorbent sponge to lift up some of that paint while it's still wet. Here I am cleaning up some edges a little bit more and dropping in a little bit more of that red in certain little sections. And this is my smallest round brush that I've selected for this process, which is a size 1. And then I am pretty much ready to allow everything to dry completely before moving on to the next part of this painting process. All right, so it's totally up to you if you want to allow your painting to dry naturally or if you want to help yourself speed up the drying process with a hairdryer. That's what I did in this case. I made sure that everything was 100% completely bone dry before getting started with this next part of the painting process. You definitely do want to change your water before getting started with this because you probably already have a lot of red in that water. And we're gonna start with painting in the green sections in these watermelon slices. And if you have some red in your water, red plus green is gonna start creating a desaturated color. You could even start creating a brownish color that you probably don't want. Why? Because red and green are complementary colors in the color wheel and they mute each other out. All right, so after everything was dry and I had changed my water, I prepared some azo green yellow on my color mixing palette. Same thing as with the red. You want to go for a nice, juicy, yet saturated color mixture with that lighter green and really every color that we're going to be preparing. And with that green color mixture ready on my color mixing palette, I removed all of that paint from my paintbrush bristles. And what I am doing right here is I am doing some pre-wetting of these outer portions of these watermelon slices. And you want to make sure that you're pre-wetting enough. I'm pre-wetting past the outer skin section, a little bit into the red section even, because I want to make sure that this green color has enough space to bleed and create soft gradients into the white portion, and then that white portion is going to turn into the red. So if you only pre-wet a very small and narrow shape, then that green color that you drop into this shape is going to probably overtake and completely expand into that small shape that you've pre-wetted. And that is going to lead to sharp defined edges because it only has a certain small shape to expand into. So you definitely want to make sure that you're pre-wetting enough space for that green. All right, so I finished up with the pre-wetting of the outer portions of all of these watermelon slices that have it showing. I tested out my light green on my scrap piece of watercolor paper there to ensure that it has a nice translucency to it, that I'm not going in super dry initially, and that color mixture hasn't completely dried out while I was doing my pre-wetting, because if so, then I would have to add a little bit more water into it to make it a little bit juicy once again. With that ready, I am now starting to drop it into these pre-wetted sections in these lower portions of these watermelon slices. So just like with the red that I painted in, I dropped in a good amount of color in these sections. Because that paper was wet, that color expanded out and bled into that wetness, and I was left with soft edges. And once I had a good amount of color on there, I removed all of the color from my paintbrush bristles, and I am going in with a clean and slightly damp paintbrush to do some lifting in some sections that I feel I darkened a little bit too much. I definitely want to make sure that there is a white looking section between the green and the red, because that's what's apparent to me in the reference photo and what I know from having seen watermelon pieces. There is a white section in between the outer green skin and the red fleshy parts, and I want to make sure that I'm leaving a section that is somewhat white looking in between the two. So if you find that you've deposited way too much of that lighter green in this area, or it has expanded way too much into this area, you can go ahead and do some lifting with your absorbent towel or your clean paintbrush bristles and use them as a little absorbent sponge. All right, so once again, I like moving from lighter color towards darker color. So after having placed that lightest green, I created a medium green for myself by mixing together my azo green yellow plus a little bit of that regular green for my St. Petersburg set, which is a very dark, deep green. So I created that medium green. I dropped it into certain sections, and hopefully you can start seeing at this point how I have little sections in which I have that lightest green showing. Then I have other sections with that medium green, which is a combination of my azo green yellow and my green. And I am now going in with the darkest green, again, making my way from lightest towards darkest. I am now dropping in my darkest green, which is the pure green with no azo green yellow added into that. And I am only adding in the darkest green into darkest sections that I want to just push those darks even more in. All right, so it was time to allow those green sections to dry completely after I developed a few different values in them. And what I did was I changed my water, and I'm gonna get to work in the red sections once again. So the objective with the second layer of paint in the red sections is going to be to only darken certain sections that need to be darkened more. And I'm also going to start dropping in some very, very dark, almost black looking color to start developing the illusion of seeds. So what you're seeing me do right here is I am creating a very deep, rich, vibrant color mixture right here on my color mixing palette by mixing together my red and my dark green. Red and green are opposites in the color wheel. They are complementary colors, as I mentioned before. This means that they mute each other out, and if I blend or mix enough of them together, a kind of 50-50 amount, I'm gonna get a very, very dark color. You can see it right here as I swatch it out on my scrap piece of watercolor paper. And this is the very dark color that I am going to be dropping into that wetness to start creating the illusion of seeds, of those bleeding out soft seeds that I'm going to be developing. Now, as I mentioned before in today's video, when I was finishing up with that preliminary pencil sketch, it is incredibly, incredibly important that if we're going for any level of realism in our work, whether it's a drawing or a painting, we have to pinpoint our light source. Where is a light source in relation to our subject or our subjects? Because The light has to stay consistent throughout, and the cast shadow has to make sense in relation to that light source. And in this case, our light source is somewhere in the upper left, slightly behind these watermelon wedges. And the reason why I am saying this is because this is something that I make sure to have in mind in the next part of this painting process, in which I'm only going to be darkening certain planes of these watermelon slices. For this part of the process, I switched on over to my size 5 round brush because I am going to be pre-wetting smaller sections of those watermelon wedges. So essentially, I am only going to be pre-wetting the planes of those structures that are facing away from the light. I am not going to be darkening any more sections in the other planes. So this time I'm pre-wetting only those planes that are facing away from the light, opposite to the light source, which contain darker values in them. And this is why I switched to a smaller paintbrush so that I can have a little bit more control versus what I did in the beginning, in which I pre-wetted the entire shape for all of the watermelon wedges all together. Make sure that you change your water once again before doing your pre-wetting because you want that red color to be nice and vibrant. So I did my pre-wetting in this plane that's opposite to the light in this particular wedge. And then once I had a nice even sheen all throughout, I dropped in more of my ruby red color only in specific sections that I wanted to darken within that plane. Notice how I left sections in which that underneath lighter, almost pink looking layer is shining through. I do not want to go in and develop a flat red value all throughout this darker plane. I still want to make sure that there is a variety of values and translucencies developed in there because otherwise that is going to lead to flatness. Okay, so I'm going to work on a couple of sections at a time before dropping in my very dark color for the seeds while that paint is still wet. So what I did right here on this plane on this other watermelon wedge is exactly the same thing. Initially, I went in and pre-wetted with clean water. I made sure to rinse out all of the previous red from my paintbrush bristles before going in and doing my pre-wetting. And then with that pre-wetting done, I dropped in a little bit more of that red to deepen and darken certain sections of this plane that is facing away from the light. With those sections still wet, I very quickly switched on over to my size 1 round brush and I started dropping in a tiny bit of that very dark color that I created by mixing together my red with my dark green. And I started dropping it in randomly in certain little spots here and there to start developing the illusion of those black seeds. And as you can see, because that paint is still wet, that new very dark paint color bled out slightly into that wetness, creating a nice diffused out soft look, soft edges. Now, if you start dropping in this very dark color and it starts expanding like crazy way too fast, it probably means that your paper is way too wet and you need to just wait a few seconds longer to drop in that paint. Or it can also mean that you have a lot of water and or paint in your paintbrush bristles. You want to make sure that your paper is damp but not sopping wet when you drop in that very dark color. And also that you're barely touching just the tip of your paintbrush and dropping in just a very small amount of paint. If it starts bleeding out like crazy though, it is not the end of the world. You can go in with a clean paintbrush and kind of lift up some of that paint color and just leave a smaller amount. This actually happens to me later and I'm able to fix it just fine by doing some lifting of that excess paint. All right, so I'm doing the exact same thing in this bottom one and I am continuing to work on 2 sections at a time and moving quickly as I can so that that paint can still be wet when I drop in that very dark color with my smaller paintbrush and that very dark color mixture that I created for myself. Right around here, you're gonna see me do 2 things to fix a couple of things that I didn't like. First, I go in to soften a section of this edge in this plane of this watermelon slice in the back. It looked very sharp and defined to me and I didn't like it very much, so I just went in to soften certain sections. And all I did was I went in with a clean and slightly damp paintbrush and ran those bristles along some sections here and there. It's a lot easier to do it while that paint is still wet, but in certain cases you can still go in and soften some sharp edges even after the paint has dried. It really depends on the type of paper that you're using and also the staining qualities of the pigment that you're using. After doing that just a few seconds ago, I also did some lifting in a very stark, very dark looking seed that I had created in that bottommost wedge. I just did a little bit of lifting with my absorbent towel and then I allowed it to dry. Essentially, if I take a step back from my piece and any particular shape that I painted in looks way too stark and distracting, or I create a visible line where I was intending to create an edge, I go in and try to soften that in some way, shape, or form. This said, do your best not to go overboard with the scrubbing and the lifting and the blending of color, because that can definitely lead to overworking your paper, damaging your paper, or an overworked, muddy look at the end. Okay, so it's time to get to work on the cast shadow area. So I changed my water once again and I created a dark gray color for myself by mixing together my ultramarine blue with my burnt umber. Take time mixing your ultramarine blue and whatever dark brown it is that you're using. Take time mixing them together and creating a color that looks like a dark gray while on your color mixing palette. Test out your color mixture, swatch it out on a scrap piece of watercolor paper until you arrive at something that looks like a dark gray. If your color mixture has more blue than brown in it, it's gonna look like a dark blue. And if it has more brown than blue in it, it's gonna look like a dark brown. So continue modifying the ratios of that color mixture until you arrive at a dark gray. And then I added some water into this gray color mixture to make sure that I was going in with this gray in a very translucent state. I did not want to go in super saturated with the dark gray. I wanted to just have cast shadows with a softer look to them and didn't want to make them way too heavy. So make sure that you add enough water into your gray color mixture. Use your scrap pieces of watercolor paper to test out your colors and your translucencies before going in. And once you have a nice light gray, what I am doing is I am using my size 5 round brush and I am painting in my cast shadow on dry paper. I'm creating a very organic, irregular look to that cast shadow shape. And while that gray is still wet, I am dropping in the lighter green and the darker green from my outer sections of those watermelons into the gray while it's still wet, so that those greens can add some vibrancy into that gray cast shadow and deepen and darken values within it. You can see how, because I painted in my cast shadow shapes on dry paper, those edges around the cast shadow shapes, even though the gray is nice and translucent, those edges are visible, they are sharp, they are defined. And just as a reminder, because we're painting in those cast shadows on dry paper, it's important that we work relatively fast. You can allow yourself to move that paint gently and minimally while that paint is still wet, or even drop in a little bit more of your gray or even more of your either green that you want to drop in. But the moment that that paint starts to dry, it's better to just embrace those irregular organic effects that happen and leave things be. All right, so we are officially in the very last leg of this painting process. There are just a few more things that I would like to do. And first, what I am doing is I am painting in the sharper, more defined seeds with my smallest brush and the same color mixture that I was using initially to paint in the seeds, which is my red plus dark green color mixture. I just reactivated that color mixture, which was starting to dry out, with a little bit of water on my color mixing palette, did a little bit of swiveling in there, and I started painting in these sharper, more defined seeds, wet on dry, so the paper is completely dry, that paint is not expanding out, and I am making sure to use this very dark color in a very translucent state. because again, I don't want to start painting in negative holes in my painting, and especially when you're using a very, very dark paint color, this can be very easy to do. And I don't want the viewer's attention to go straight to any particular seed or anything like that. So I would highly recommend testing out this color mixture on your scrap piece of watercolor paper before going in, to make sure that you're not going in super dark and saturated with this very dark color mixture. So you can already see how some of my seeds are looking sharper and more defined because I've painted them in on dry paper, while others still look very blurred out and soft because I dropped in that color on paper that was wet. That's exactly what I wanted. I wanted lots of variation in these seeds, not only in terms of their size and the way they are rotating within that slice of watermelon and their placement within that overall form, but also in terms of how sharp versus how blurred out their edges are. I didn't want to add way too many seeds either. It's very easy to overdo it. However, if you take a look at your piece and you find that you want to add a few more seeds, whether they are the blurred out type or the sharper type, you can still do it. If you want to add a few seeds with blurred out edges, then all you have to do is go in and do some pre-wetting in that section of that watermelon slice. Make sure that you're doing your pre-wetting with clean water, of course, and then you can drop in just a little bit of that very dark color to get your blurred out seed. And if you want to add more seeds with defined edges, then just make sure that you're painting them in with a translucent version of your gray on paper that is dry. Right here, I am taking a quick moment to also deepen and darken some green sections within these outer portions of these watermelon slices closer to us. And all I did was I used my size 5 round brush to do pre-wetting of these sections using clean water, and then I started dropping in my green. So if you only have very light green values developed, then maybe you want to drop in a little bit more of your lightest green. And if you want to maybe develop some green midtones, maybe you can create more of that medium green color mixture by mixing together your two greens. And if you only want to deepen and darken darkest green sections, then you can just use your darkest green by itself. However, make sure that you're leaving plenty of that previous layer shining through, because again, it's all about developing a wide variety of greens. You want to make sure that you have very light greens, that you have medium greens, and you have darker greens. Right here, I switched on back to my smallest round brush, my size 1, and I'm just cleaning up some little edges here and there, deepening and darkening certain little spots. All right, and finally, I am just gonna go ahead and add a few more details here and there. I'm gonna deepen and darken certain sections within my seeds because watercolor is almost always going to look lighter when it dries than how it looks when it is wet. So you can certainly feel free to go in and darken certain sections here and there. I'm gonna also add some seeds on the surface that these watermelon wedges are on to add in a little bit more interest into the piece. And finally, I'm also going to be darkening certain little sections all throughout the reds in the watermelon slices. And I am going in with my size 5 round brush on dry paper with my ruby red color. And as you can see, I am just painting in very abstract, organic, irregular shapes to just define certain sections along those edges and deepen and darken certain spots. Because I am painting in these last red abstract shapes on dry paper, I am bound to get some defined edges around the shapes that I am painting in. And if I ever want to go in and do some softening of those edges, all I have to do is run my paintbrush bristles along those edges to soften them. Right here, you're gonna see me pre-wet a little section of this watermelon slice before dropping in some red because I wanted a diffused out soft look. I wanted to create a nice soft gradient. So it's all about giving thought to whether you want sharp defined edges around the shapes that you're painting in. And if so, you go in on dry paper. And if you want that soft diffused gradient to happen, then just do some pre-wetting. Just make sure that you're using clean water and then drop in a little bit of color. Make sure that you're doing all of this loosely, lightly, and remember that less is more. Okay, so just finishing up here, hopefully you can see how by going in and deepening and darkening certain values, whether it's in the greens or the reds or even in the seeds, and also defining some edges very loosely, I managed to create a little bit more of a 3D look and also make things pop a little bit more. All right, you guys, that is gonna do it for today's video. I really hope that you found some helpful nuggets in it, that you found it inspiring, and if you did, pretty please, I'd super appreciate it if you give this video a thumbs up and share with family or friends who you think would find it helpful as well. That really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and allows others to get to know about my channel. Thank you so much for watching today. Don't forget to subscribe so that I can see you next week for another video, and keep on creating. Bye guys!